As early as the 2nd century AD, Roman doctors astonishingly recognized werewolfism as a psychological disease, a form of depression. But the treatment seemed as bad as a werewolf attack, the opening of a vein and letting of blood. While the cure was barbaric, the diagnosis was quite perceptive. Today, psychiatrists have a name for the mental illness in which a person believes he or she actually changes into a wolf, lycanthropy. Such a person may even howl, crave raw meat, or run around on all fours during an attack of this sickness.
There are now enough cases that we can begin to look at them and see that there are people who have these grand delusions that they can change and do change into different animals, and that when they get into that delusion, they even act out the part and do things that we think of as being associated with the animals.
By the mid-17th century, people had begun to realize that those who proclaimed themselves to be wolves were instead insane. Many victims were sent off to monasteries rather than being burned at the stake. A few imagined werewolves were not insane, though. They might have been under the influence of drugs. Ointments were often concocted by so-called witches to treat the illnesses of peasant folk. Into a cauldron went plants and herbs such as poppy seeds from opium, aconite or wolfbane, which slows down the heart, and belladonna, a poisonous plant also known as deadly nightshade. When rubbed into the skin, this magic salve entered the bloodstream and induced mental confusion, wild excitement, and delirium. Thinking one had become a werewolf would not be out of the question. Another possible hallucinogen occurred in rye bread, a staple of the European peasants' diet in the Middle Ages. When winters were extremely cold, a fungus called ergot infected the rye. The bread could induce LSD-type hallucinations, such as seeing a werewolf or being one.
Suddenly, a perfectly normal person became wild, mad, bestial, whatever. It affects the brain. People go quite nuts. They run around and you know, act crazy, and there have been murders, berserk situations that have been attributed to people eating this poison.
Reports of villagers frightened by the sight of a ragged human running through the forest fueled fears of werewolves. But the culprit was often just a hermit. And there were a few cases of feral or wild children who, after being lost or abandoned, had learned forest survival skills. Amala and Kamala were among 16 children supposedly raised by wolves who were found in India between 1843 and 1933. When the girls were removed from a wolf lair in 1920, they walked on all fours, ate nothing but raw meat, and howled to escape captivity. Amala died within 1 year at the age of about 2.5. Kamala died 9 years later at age 17. Perhaps the most famous feral child was Victor of Aveyron, whose story was told in the 1969 François Truffaut film, The Wild Child. In 1797, French villagers became frightened by a mysterious wild man seen running through the woods. 3 years later, a naked 12-year-old boy was captured. He was covered with cuts and bruises and terrified of humans. And he preferred to eat nuts and berries to any prepared food. Victor lived to the age of 40, but never learned to speak. Another explanation for werewolf sightings could be 2 medical diseases discovered later. One, hypertrichosis, is a rare genetic disorder that occurs in 1 in every billion births. It causes increased hair growth all over the body.
And this can be very extensive, so extensive that it virtually covers the skin surface and makes the child look like a dog or animal or a werewolf.
In the 16th century, this disease was observed in Peter Gonzalez and his children.
There are these wonderful drawings of the people with these furry faces, looking, by the way, very much like the Lon Chaney Jr. makeup.
During the Middle Ages, such people could have easily been mistaken for werewolves.
Seeing these pictures would lead people to believe, oh my, yes, yeah, goodness, yes, it's all true.
The second disease that may have helped perpetuate the werewolf myth is porphyria. It's an extremely rare form of a genetic blood disorder first recognized early in the 20th century. In some severe cases, patients are so sensitive to sunlight that prolonged exposure could result in the loss of tissue from the extremities, face, and head.
Somebody like this might tend to come out late at night. If they had a lot of damage to their tissues, their hands particularly, their hands might be sort of tend to hold their hands in a clawed up position. If the tissue was lost from their lips, their teeth would be more exposed, and there would be this brownish color which people might associate with blood, plus this slight amount of extra hair growth, particularly around the temples.
Some experts dispute the scientific and medical data, saying they are insufficient explanations for the broad-based, pervasive belief in werewolves during the 16th and 17th centuries.
Werewolf beliefs are not just in a few places where LSD might have gotten into the food supply. Werewolves are not just in a few places where there might have been outbreaks or family traditions of porphyria. It's a much larger phenomena than that. The werewolf mythos has come down to us through the ages, basically as a myth about our inner nature. The animal side of us, as we like to think about it, as opposed to the spiritual side. It has a certain amount of appeal because we are animals, after all.
I think it's a mistake to go look for rational explanations, because on some level it's not. People have always been fascinated with the blurred boundary, between human beings and animals, especially of the fear of the beast within.